Hi, everyone. We are live. My name is Kellyanne. I'm a bookseller for Mysterious Galaxy, and I am here to host your event this evening. Before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful guests tonight. Tonight we have John Teton. He is the director of International Film Festival award-winning short films and produced the cosmology film program Visions at T-0, as well as the author of several works of fiction, including appearing live at the Final Test, Upsurge, and Elevation, the Cave Logs of New Hale, Tibet. Today he's here to discuss his novel, The Book of Geezer, which is a rollicking tale of a brother and sister whose obsession with their mysterious elderly neighbor propels them into a mystery far more fantastic than they had anticipated. We are also joined by our conversation partner, David Rottman. He's the past president and chairman of the board of directors at the C.G. Jung Foundation of New York. He's taught over 40 courses on topics ranging from understanding dreams, complexes, anxieties, self-expression and creativity, and self-renewal. And he's the author of Sex, Love, and Therapy. Before we get started, and I pass this off to our lovely authors, just a little bit of housekeeping for you all. On the right-hand side, you'll see our lovely chat section where you are welcome to comment as the event goes on and talk to our wonderful author. Below our video, you'll see a button that says buy books with signed book plates. That'll take you straight to the Mysterious Galaxy website where you can purchase the Book of Geezer, and that will come with a signed book plate from John. And last but not least, below that button, there is a button that says ask a question. If you click that, you can type your question, any question that you have for John, also any questions that you have for David, maybe. And at the end of the event, they will get around to that and answer as many questions as they can. So with that, I'm going to hop off screen and let you guys have a wonderful event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome to a discussion of the Book of Geezer with the author John Teton. As she mentioned, the book is an adventure tale of two very curious twins, Zeb and Marley, who wind up taking a tour of the universe without having expected to do it. And the action of the book starts with their encounter with a character named Geezer. And of course, the book is named for him, The Book of Geezer. So John, perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about Geezer himself and the role that he plays in the book.
Well, thank you, David. I'll be delighted to. Just before that, I do want to thank Kellyanne and Constance for setting this up with Mysterious Galaxy Bookstore. It's a unique institution, and this country's lucky to have it. It's been around for quite a while in San Diego, and it was done with the help of Lucille Lang Day, the publisher of Scarlet Tanager Books, and Natalie Mulford of Mulford Media. And of course, I want to thank you, David. That eloquent mini bio of you did not mention that you also had part of your career involved as being a senior editor at Random House Books, but it's helped lay the groundwork for your copious knowledge about the industry of books. Now, Geezer is not the character's name. It is a title character name given to him by these twins who are 21. And part of the story also involves something that happened between them and Geezer when they were 4 years younger. They don't know much about him. He's lived on an island in the middle of a lake next to them. And for a number of years, rarely did they see him. They think he's a doddering old guy that can barely make it around, which is actually a ruse on his part. He's actually a brilliant and powerful fellow, an African-American who has a lot of research experience and became obsessed at earlier on in his life with an event that was associated with total solar eclipses. And he's jealous and very carefully guarded his privacy. So they don't know much about him, and they just refer to him that way. But through happenstance, they follow him to the site of a total solar eclipse in Antarctica. And that leads them much, much farther, all the way to the inside of the sun and eventually far beyond. So that's Geezer.
Now, the wonderful thing about science fiction is that it sort of propels science forward in a way that even scientists can't do. And people reading this and hearing what you've just said would want to know what happens to a person inside the sun and what mechanism allows them to do that. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I realize that might seem a little unlikely, but as with all science fiction, there are usually one or more elements that make things that would seem to be impossible otherwise possible. In this case, there is a plasmatic tower that's created that holds the passengers and that preserves conditions on Earth, including air pressure, temperature, and prevents the passengers within from being blinded or roasted. So I've loved science since I was a kid. I actually considered at one point going into astronomy, but I also love the possibilities of creative imagination. So this book attempts, as well as its predecessors, to hybridize in a literary kind of way the language and interests and subject matter of hard science with effervesced by what imagination makes possible. And so there is research that goes into it. And I think the readers are going to be pretty able to tell when something that's being described is as, quote, hard science, when it is perhaps speculative science, but of the kind that could take place among scientists not attempting to get into the materials of pure imagination. And then the more wild, fancy-free things that can happen if you let that be the foundation upon which you build a creative story.
Yes, you build a world in this book which is remarkable in the way that it takes people on what would be a visual tour through words and imagination of the entire universe. And one of the pieces of science that I found thrilling was an idea that I'd never run across before, which was the idea that we could use the galaxy scale gravitational assist to slingshot our way around the universe. It's an idea that I think is taking science to a whole nother level with the imagination, and it's something that is very well expressed by the characters in the book. Tell me a little bit about how you decided on the fact that they would be twins and the nature of their relationship as they go into this adventure.
Okay, well, the book has a kind of unusual history. It was originally, those who've seen the book will know that there are two huge stories, and one of them takes place when these two were only 17. That was actually drafted originally as a screenplay. And at the time, actually, they were conceived of as being 15 years old. But it kind of sat on the sidelines for a very long time. When more recently I decided that it shouldn't be just kept on the sidelines, and moreover that there were some wonderful possibilities for a sequel. So the two stories, what happens to them at 17 again at 21, are woven together, and they are at this point, most of the story takes place when they're at their older age. They're pursuing ambitious careers in art and science. Zeb is a graphic novelist and a pilot, no doubt inspired by his rather extraordinary flights from when he was a teenager. And then Marley, his sister, is a brilliant young physicist with an invention that she's going to be pitching to Silicon Valley venture capitalists shortly. They live north of San Francisco, and it's not hard for them to pull that off. Besides, she's a Stanford student. So that's how it got started. And I trust that the braiding together of these two stories will not be too confusing. It doesn't go back and forth every page. There's a whole segment, part 2 of 3, which is what happened to them originally 4 years earlier. And then the rest of the book continues from what happens now.
Would you agree that Marley is the wiser of the two?
Well, obviously, scientifically, she is. She's a real crackerjack in her field of plasma science. But each of them is very supportive of the other, and she fully acknowledges that her brother is brilliant in his own way, and he's capable of understanding anything she has to say, although he's not so scientifically inclined to have come up with it, what the kind of invention that she has. So, yeah, in fact, my wife has 2 first cousins who are twins, brother and sister twins, that have lived in that very area, and they kind of inspired me to what a wonderful relationship like that can be.
Yeah, I think it's a very special book in many ways, and one of the ways it's special is that you have a young male and a young female who are sort of equals in their contributions to the adventure, and they relate very well to each other. So you can learn a certain amount about relating as a young person in this book, kind of snuck in there in some way. I love her beautiful quote. The reason why I asked, is she the wiser of the two, is because she says, and I'm quoting directly from the book here, "Life is so intensely rich in mysteries beckoning to be solved by the enterprise of physics." So she's a person who has a scientific background, but has maintained her sense of mystery and wonder. And I think that's probably a very good description of you as well, because it comes across all the way through the book. Let me ask you another question about the aim of the book, of what you would like to have the reader take away from this book, aside from the fact of being really well entertained with the great plot turns that go on in the story.
You're going to ask a question along those lines?
Yes. What would you like people to take away?
Oh, I see.
Aside from the fact that they're going to take away that they were entertained.
Yeah. Okay. This answer is best contextualized with the first 3 books, which I call an Isosceles Trilogy. The first 3 books that were mentioned by Kellyanne earlier, Appearing Live at the Final Test, Upsurge, and Elevation, they're quite independent. They appear to be totally independent, although the first 2 of them are actually very closely knit in a way that is not revealed until the reader has read the second of those 2, whichever order they read them in, because the key to the connection is split in half. Half of the key is in the end of each of those books. And then the third one, Elevation, is distantly related to them. All 3 deal with contemporary real-world problems, despite their rather spectacular dives into, I would call fantasy, but not in the way that the bookstores deal with medievalism and unicorns. And they blend that with some very wild science fiction. And there are things to be taken from those 3 books in terms of ideas as how to address these problems. The problems dealt with among the 3 include terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, poverty, and evil itself. None of that applies to the Book of Geezer. The Book of Geezer is designed to be a tremendous splash. Of whether it actually works that way for any given reader is up to the individual, but a splash into escapist fun without any such connections to the real world. And that also applies to the next novel that I'm halfway through right now.
Mm-hmm.
So what they want them to take away from this one is sheer fun.
Hmm.
and to have their imagination stretched, because the stretching of imaginations is part of creative science. If it's not creative, it's scientific processes are pretty much comparatively mundane. Speculative science can get to be quite wildly unrooted in what we know about the real world. For example, Timothy Ferris's book, Coming of Age in the Milky Way, deals with advanced theories about astrophysics and cosmology, which are quite speculative. And they and then you take it another giant step beyond that to complete fictionalizing. So yeah, I hope people enjoy it at all those levels.
Mm-hmm. Well, following on what you've just said, one of the questions we need to know is, what do you think people experience inside a black hole? And can a person, including the main character or one of the main characters, return from such an experience?
Well, I don't want to say too much about what happens, but the black hole, and there are black holes that's been established after having been simply theorized for many years. And there is one at the center of this galaxy, the Milky Way. And that is, it's kind of like, what does Rosebud mean in Citizen Kane? They really want to know what, they don't even realize when they're headed there at first, where they're headed. Eventually they pick up on it, and they do get there. I'm not saying too much there, but that is a huge mystery for them that they want to solve. And so I have to kind of place some guardrails around what goes on there. But I hope they find it worth the journey.
The interesting thing from a psychological point of view is that there was a concurrent, if you take the last 150 years as a very short time in human history, a concurrent idea in psychology that when a person goes into a complex, all their psychological energy is sucked into the complex and disappears, and no light gets emitted. So there's a way in which all the so-called speculative ideas of science fiction are relevant to our what goes on inside our psyche and what goes on in our culture. And that leads me to the question, what do you think is the role of science fiction to contribute to our culture more generally?
Well, A, entertainment, but B, it should get people thinking, if it's original, and the fact is most genre work in science fiction is a genre, I'm afraid to say is pretty formulaic. And so like it's a James Bond movie pattern where what exactly the villain is trying to do and how James Bond et al. Might undo that, they have to change, and they do change from movie to movie in unusual and entertaining ways. But the fundamentals are so well established that anybody who's seen a number of those or read a lot of science fiction can pretty well predict certain elements of what's going to happen. For example, in Isaac Asimov's Foundation, right off the bat on the first page, you're off in outer space in rockets. Well, we don't have rockets here, although we do get into outer space. So I want people to feel ideally elated at having new vistas opened up in what can happen in a literary adventure. And I say literary, that is a word that some people will know within a specific context of the book industry. And it refers to a class of books which is not necessarily generic in its formulation and in the kind of language that's used. Most science fiction, at least a lot of it, uses a more restricted kind of vocabulary. And but the English language, as it great potential to be used in ways that extend beyond formulaic genre work. So that I attempt to exploit that potential in this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask a couple of questions about you as a writer. When did you know you would be a writer, and when did you know you would be writing in this genre?
Well, my actual training is in filmmaking, and I started out writing. I was about 21, and I realized that the stuff I was writing was very visual, and it would need a visual medium. So I decided I'd better learn filmmaking, and I asked around where is the best film class somebody could take in the summer, and I was told it was at New York University, where there was a teacher there named Marty Scorsese. And I applied to get in. I was told it was full. I kept applying. I was told no about 8 times. But on the very day it started, I went down there, and the assistant introduced me to Scorsese, told him there was one spot, and Scorsese gave it to me. So I started filmmaking, and I've made some films of my own, quite a few films for other people. But getting a film that costs millions of dollars to make is, many filmmakers have said the hardest part of filmmaking is getting the financing to make the film.
Sure.
And rather than be squashed by that, I decided to take, I think the first one was Upsurge, and turn it into, well, Upsurge and Appearing Live at the Final Test, I turned them into novels. And then with Elevation, I didn't even bother to write a screenplay. I just didn't want to put in all that time and effort because, as I say, these are not formulaic work, and Hollywood is infamous for favoring genre and remakes and so forth, and rarely opening the doors to more original work. Reportedly, Spielberg himself had a great deal of trouble getting Hollywood to back one of his best films, which was Schindler's List, after he'd been enormously successful. So I went straight to the novel form with this after that initial experiment with the screenplay on Geezer, and liked doing it, and I'm doing it right now again.
Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say that your work is very visual and very influenced by a kind of a screenwriter's view of what we're seeing, and kind of places us in the visual field of that the characters are experiencing in a way that we're sort of really sharing it with them?
The screenwriting impact has been huge on me as a writer, because in screenwriting you find that because you have all this tremendous additional potential of sound and picture, you don't need as many words to be written either for scene descriptions or dialogue. And what is there should be ideally masterfully concise. And so, if anything, I've been chastised by a couple of filmmakers or other family members for not expanding some of the scenes in my material because they get hungry for a given scene. They want to learn more about it. But I must confess that because of the screenwriting, I keep a lot of the focal point of the drive on following the narrative. In a really great screenplay, for example, Casablanca or Wizard of Oz, every single word counts. And many of the words that were in the screenplay are not spoken, but rather help create the environment around it. So that's, I would say, the effect of the initial experience of screenwriting.
Mm-hmm. And as a child, did you have any what we might characterize as unusual fantasy life that would have indicated that this was going to be a calling for you?
I didn't recognize anything unusual particularly, although I've discovered that certain things were. For example, my fascination with astronomy, which began when I was a pretty young kid. And then as an early teenager, I remember starting to get visual images that I thought were very interesting to me. And in college, we had one class where we were allowed to, individual students would take over the class. So I took it over, and I had everybody lie down on their backs and the intention being, and the heads were all in the circle in the center. The intention there was to free the imagination to come up with whatever might strike them. And so I went first, and when I went first, it was followed by kind of a dead silence. And then the other students said, well, I'm not going next. And they said, you should be a poet or something. Apparently they thought that the images that I had generated were really unusual. And to me, I didn't realize how unusual they were. So I began to step closer and closer. And that whole incident with taking that film class followed about 6-8 months later.
Mm-hmm.
And now I find that I feel very fortunate that I can still do this, because many writers are finished by age 60 or 50, and in some notable cases, even before 30. That has not been a problem for me, nor do I suffer from writer's block.
Mm-hmm.
Glad about that.
Of course. So would you say that those visual images that you first experienced then still come to you with the same quality and energy and so forth?
Absolutely. I don't know, what book these books have all been quite unlike my other books. Each one is unlike the others and others I've read. So I never know how an audience is going to react to it. But at least I know that I'm not just copying other authors. That's really important to me. So it's original stuff, and whether it's good or not is up to the individual reader to decide.
Yeah, I think it's very safe to say that there's nothing like it. I was going to introduce your book by saying it's a one-of-a-kind book, and then I thought, oh, well, everybody says that, but in fact, it's really true. There isn't anything like this book.
Well, it means a lot for me to hear you say that.
Yeah.
I don't think I told those assembled here. I did tell Kellyanne, who got us launched here earlier on, that David Rottman was a senior editor at Random House and knows the book industry much better than I do, or most people. So hearing that from you does mean a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, certainly. And that brings a question to bear. How much editing and feedback from others has gone into this book?
I take it through stages. Initially, I have a very small group of people who are very interested in this sort of process, and they'll read it, what I call a rough draft, even though by the time I get to a rough draft, it's already been through a few other drafts. After that, I'll send it to others who have more experience and who might, if they're enthusiastic, write a blurb for it. And eventually it will go out to perhaps editors and publishers. Lucille Langday, who created Scarlet Tanager Books, has been publishing for years and has put out dozens of books, almost all in the area of poetry. She's also an author of other types of work herself, as well as being a recognized poet. But I'm really grateful to her for expanding Scarlet Tanager's province to include a outright science fiction novel for the first time here.
That's the first time they've done it.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay,
So,
well, what?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, being different than the genre, in this case, worked in my favor.
Uh-huh, right. Yeah, it's a genre of its own, really, on some level. Yeah. Okay, well, I see there are a number of questions. Let me pop into the Ask a Question area. And I see some of these questions we've covered, others not. Here's a first question. What was the process like of converting a screenplay into a full novel? Were there any challenges? Is there anything more you'd like to say about that topic? You did address it to some degree.
Well, these are individual art forms, and just because somebody's got experience with one doesn't mean they're good at it, and if they are good at it, doesn't mean they're going to be good at the others. So I did have to learn how to do that. I think it's actually easier to go in the direction I did from screenwriting to novel writing than the other way around. And it's kind of liberating because you are so restricted. In fact, when you write a screenplay, you're really writing it only for a very select audience. Most people have never read a screenplay. And if they do read a screenplay, if they're not really familiar with that medium, can find it kind of awkward, because a lot of it, it's like a blueprint. And not everybody can look at a blueprint and imagine what the house is going to look like. In a screenplay, there are directions, but they're written they have the dual function of inspiring the reader, but also communicating in a concise way very specific things that various crew members, director of photography, sound design, set decoration, on and on, all those credits you see at the end of a movie, these are all artists that are contributing to a single vision that's initially woven in the screenplay and then interpreted by the director. So it is liberating to get into the fictional narrative voice, but there are huge possibilities within that. There's not just one way to do it, the most common being the third person omniscient narration. It's not the only way to write a book, and there are wonderful subtle variations. For example, Lonesome Dove uses a kind of McMurtry very cagily shifts the tone of his supposedly omniscient narration into the kind of language and mindset of the characters he's describing, and then he comes out of that, and there's never any titling about that. It's a subtle thing. Others stick with straight third person. A lot of my work is first person because that's the way that we see the world. The third person omniscient narration, which may have developed around a campfire 100,000 years ago, that is not how people live. People live in the first person. And so if you want to see what a particular character's thoughts and experiences are like, it can help to go into that realm.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Okay, here's another question. Was Geezer inspired by Neil deGrasse Tyson on an archetypal Jungian level?
Not at all. I appreciate what Neil has done for the love of astronomy, but he had absolutely nothing to do with it. So I don't want to tie him into that. But I'm glad that the American Museum of Natural History has enlisted him to do what he does.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's an interesting question. How much of the book came from a dream state?
Well, I've done some recording of dreams. I do tend to remember dreams better than most people, but that's not really where these books come from. This is a form of work, and it doesn't have the hazards and dangers of other types of work I could mention, including, for example, coal mining, being a test pilot. But for me, it's a matter of going to work and focusing and having to take the work through the various stages of novel writing, which include concept development, brainstorming, in other words, organization. You can have great ideas and they can be organized as a big mess. And there's some great writers who have been incredibly great at stage one and not so good at stage two. Stage three is drafting, which is getting the material that people are actually going to read on the page. And then the fourth stage is revision. And if you're not prepared and skilled and able enough to do all four of those well, you're going to have serious troubles as a novelist. So to me, it's work, and it's work that's fun. Mm-hmm. It's not the only work I do, like you. David Rottman has done a lot of different careers, often several in parallel, and so have I. Filmmaking and novel writing being just two of several other, and there are several others that I juggle.
Here's a beautiful comment from a reader that isn't a question, but I'd just like to read it for everyone and for you, John. Going back to the question about what people can take away from this book, I would say it reinforces the idea that men and women are equals in terms of intelligence, creativity, problem-solving ability, etc. It also demonstrates the importance of collaboration in order to accomplish something. Moreover, it's a grand celebration of human imagination and encourages people to develop their own imagination. I'm sure there are other things too. The book is more than just fun and games.
I love that comment, and the equality of men and women, male and female, has been important to me for a very long time. And so we don't have a case where the female character is there as a kind of a sidekick or some beautiful, somewhat impotent figure to be rescued off the railroad tracks. And that's true about the female leads in the other books. All of them have female leads, and the new book will have a female lead on her own. So that and the whole comment, I do appreciate whoever said that. That is kind of rewarding to hear, I must say.
I don't know whether it's appropriate to read the name of the person or not, so I'm not going to do it, but you'll be able to see it when you check out the questions. I would say in response to that question and what you just said, that if any leading young actress has a good agent, and is looking for good roles for them in a movie or in a series, this might very well be what they want to get their hands on.
Yeah, I have to say that it's one reason I shortened the gap between the young Marley and the older one. It's now just 4 years, so a single actress could play that character at both ages without any difficulty in a movie.
Well, I think that was pretty sharp of you, John. Okay, so here's another question. What was involved in the research process involved in the book to learn the science behind it? I would add on to that question, how long did it take you, and where did you go for your research?
Well, research is, I like doing it, and some work has required more than others. For example, my first screenplay, written with Kentucky novelist Gurney Norman, is set in the Appalachian coal field. I did not grow up out there. I did move my family there when this project came around, and spent months researching the area, the culture, the specific industry of coal mining, the problems that it has had to deal with. And that is, in everything I do, there's going to be a need for some research, and it's just one of the exciting parts of this kind of work. I have wide-ranging interests, and I suppose it was an accomplishment to be able to focus on one thing to get a college major done, because there's so many other things I wanted to do. So not everybody is up for that, and doing a genre book with the very familiar restraints of that genre might confine the kind of or extent of research somebody has to engage in. But I like doing it. So where do I get it? Books, periodicals, YouTube has been fantastic for everybody, and the internet in general. Of course, you have to be selective, and you can't just assume something because it's online is legit, but you can also learn to recognize legitimate sources of information. Mm-hmm. You read Elevation, which is set mostly in Tibet, and I was very happy when you told me that anybody reading that book would think that I'd lived there for 10 years, which is not true. But there was a great deal of research into creating Tibet as it's shown in that book. So it does take way more time. It takes years for me to do a book. The one thing that went super fast was a screenplay I've written set in the world of baseball. It's a romantic comedy. And I'd been involved with baseball since I was, I don't know, 6 years old. There was some research there, but the entire thing was done in 3 months. No novel of mine has ever come close to being done that quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, a question that comes here and also has a vote is, what was your favorite scene to write in this book?
That's kind of like asking which of your kids is your favorite.
I knew you were going to say that.
I just can't answer that. Some scenes are, you know, many scenes are very fun to do. And if it's not one of the most fun, it's probably angling towards one that is fun. There have been in my earlier books some very difficult scenes to write because they involved perhaps violence or something that I know people are going to find difficult, but are nonetheless essential to the drama. And I would see those coming months ahead and kind of dread having to do them, but they have to be done well or why bother? So again, whether it's done well or not is up to the reader, but I will say that those kinds of scenes do require kind of psychological preconditioning, whereas this book being all about fun was a lot easier. I can't just pick out one. I hope that ideally everybody finds every scene super fun. We'll see how they actually react to it.
Okay. Here's a question. What are some of your favorite authors, and did you feel any of them had influence on your writing?
Well, in terms of those first three books, the writers who were influential, because the books themselves are very different from other books, but there were influential writers, and mainly in philosophy, people like Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead, for example, come to mind. Olaf Stapledon, who was a fiction writer as well as a philosopher. But in terms of the fiction influences, I've read a fair amount, not as much as some people. But I can't say, well, let me give you an example. Timothy Robbins, that he's a writer who is very willing to expand the bounds of what literature can involve, and I respect that a great deal. And that, in a sense, that's I mean Tom Robbins, not the actor Timothy. That is inspiring in that respect. But I wouldn't call what he does, at least the works I've read, science fiction at all. They're certainly fantastical. They're what's called speculative fiction in the industry.
Okay. Here's another writing question. What does your typical writing process look like? Do you have a daily writing routine, or do you write when the inspiration strikes?
Okay, well, by the way, did my picture disappear?
No, I still have you, and
okay.
I mean loud and clear.
I have you.
Okay. Yeah, I get up early enough to write one session early in the day. And then when other circumstances allow, there might be one or two or three more such sessions as the day and evening go on. But it's important to get that early start, because otherwise, as I told you, I'm juggling other careers, and they can swallow up my time, and I have to make sure that gets done. So that's the routine part of it. As the book gets nearer and nearer to the end, more and more time gets swallowed up in that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Here's a question that is another one of those. It's very directly one of those. Which of your children do you love more? Kind of questions. Which twin do you relate to more, and why?
Well, Zeb is a guy, so there's that. But I relate very strongly to Marley as well. I happen to be in love with both of the sciences. It turns out Zeb is actually very knowledgeable about biology, and that doesn't frame his professional identity at all. But Marley respects that in him. She thinks, at one point in the book, she says, biology is messy and dirty, and physics is pure and clean. And I wish he could appreciate that more, but he does appreciate it. My point here is that both of them reflect different parts of me, and so I was very happy to get to know them both and bring them out in print.
Do you, are you, Stephen King has a distinction between those people who plot out and write out an outline of their book and then just write it according to the plot, and the other people who he calls pantsers, who go by the seat of their pants and discover what's going to happen in the book as they write it along. Do you have an idea of which one you belong into more?
The first category.
Uh-huh.
I believe that that pantsers are fine, and they've done some very good work, but to me, the organization, I like that if I can get much of the work to be done in a subtle ways that people can't quite see it, they're still experiencing it, and that's important to me. So there's actually a great deal of attention that goes into something that might look like a very casual comment thrown in, might have been thrown in by the pantser technique, I suppose, but very likely it was the result of some careful thought about exactly where it belongs.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask a closing question.
Okay.
And, many people say that the most important photograph ever taken was the photograph by the astronauts of the Earth from the moon, which shows that we're floating, we're the creatures in outer space. We're floating in this vast and distant universe. In your book, there's an opportunity to kind of expand on that photograph and see what the whole universe would look like from the character's point of view. What impact do you think that has on a person reading the book?
I have to ask you to be a little more specific on the question, because I'm not sure.
Well, I'm fishing, as you probably can tell from the question. Don't you think, I could put it this way, that getting a view of the whole universe visually, taking a tour of the universe as you give the reader through the eyes of these characters, don't you think that that would relativize a person's point of view about what's going on this small little planet?
Okay, well, by the way, somebody's pointed out there is a sound problem, and I may have created this myself.
I hear something in the background, but it's not too disturbing.
Oh.
It's very minor.
At the opening of the book Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, he says, perhaps seeing what seems to be our very small lives here on this one planet among hundreds of billions of stars and hundreds of billions of galaxies will enhance rather than minimize our sense of our having a place in the universe and what importance it might have. I believe that. And that's Appearing Live at the Final Test got right at that. Are you still there?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I fixed the sound problem, but I can't see you. So anyway, that's what I would say about the astronomical or universal or cosmic perspective. And the two books, Appearing Live at the Final Test and Upsurge, together develop that. That's the aim, or a principal aim of those books, is to make that point. And I'm sure that millions of people would say, well, that's ridiculous. Einstein himself basically characterized human activity as being essentially inconsequential given the magnitude of the context in which we live physically. But I do invite people to read those first two books to see how that might not be the case. And I accept the scoffing that some would, I'm sure, toss my direction on account of that claim. But at least people who've read those two books will have seen the argument for why it's maybe not a ridiculous idea.
Okay, very good. All right, so maybe we have, I think we've run out of time. There's one last question.
I was gonna say, We probably have we have time to squeeze one in.
All right.
Like,
One last question. And by the way, I think I'm correct in saying that if you have questions that didn't get answered or you want to pose to John to answer after we're finished, he said that he would be very glad to get those questions, and Kellyanne will tell more about that. Here's the last question. I would love to hear more about your relationship with birds, since they play such a big role in the book.
Well, I didn't have much of a relationship with birds until in my late 20s. I had a dream about very human, but in a way magical woman who showed me a couple of little eagle chicks made of purple light. And as it turned out, I actually met that woman and married her, and I've been married to her for more than 40 years. My wife Jennifer comes from a family of naturalists, and this goes back generations. And our son Ben is actually a biologist now, and one of quite a few in that field from my wife's family. And my relationship has been paralleled by a growing love and knowledge of birds. My college roommate is a world-class expert, the leading expert on the birds of Puerto Rico. And so I have various ways in which I can connect with it without becoming an ornithologist myself. I have too many things going on to become an ornithologist. But I do feel that we're so lucky that Earth has been graced with birds. When the Star Trek crew went off to a planet and eventually figured out what was wrong was there were no birds there, that would be a desperate type of famine for Earth to endure. But I'm sure we won't ever have to.
Very good.
well, thank you. Thank you guys so much for your time. Thanks, John and David, for joining us. And like David said, if there were questions that you guys had and thought of and we didn't get to, and you want to throw them in the question box last minute, John has kindly offered to go through and answer them. And he can do that either directly in a comment to your questions in the question box or in the chat here. Those will remain, and you guys can rewatch the event and show your friends if they missed it by coming back to this page. There will be a replay and the chat stays. So you'll be able to read all of those comments back and John's responses after the event has ended. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us tonight.
I second that, Kellyanne. I should have mentioned the audience as being critically important to this event, and I appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much for your questions. Audiences are really what makes these virtual events great. So thanks so much for your participation. And as a last minute reminder, you can buy John's book by clicking that green button that says buy books with signed book plates, and you will get a signed book plate from John with your book of Geezer. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Many thanks. Take care.
Take care, everyone.